Today we're going to look at some of the most dangerous landings, starting with this guy, fighting some strong gusty crosswinds. But look what he does right here. See how it looks like there's a gap on the engine? Well, that's because he has the thrust reversers deployed while the plane is still in the air. Now we're going to see some more dangerous landings from Ryanair later on, but for right now, realize that this isn't normal. And you're going to see in these videos why it's almost always better to go around than to try to force a bad landing. Because if you're trying to land on what might be the world's most dangerous runway, then there isn't any margin for error. This is in Portugal, France, and the runway is only about 1,700 feet long, and it has over an 18% gradient. There's no instrument approach procedure, no lighting aids, and because of the steep Alps, there's really no option to go around. So if you mess up the landing like this next guy does, because you're either going too fast or because you land too long, then because of the slope and the condition of the runway, you can end up basically not having any options left other than to just crash into the snowbank, but thankfully everyone was okay. And even if the runway isn't icy, the landing can still be dangerous because the slope of the land on the approach and the fact that this runway is only about 2,100 feet long can really make landing a challenge. Now pay attention to where he touches down, because that's about halfway down the runway, and that doesn't leave a lot of room to stop, but the next plane doesn't do as good. If you're either too fast or it's too windy and you end up floating a long ways down the runway, then do you see the white rectangles that are in front of him? Well, those are about 500 feet from the end of the runway, and he doesn't actually land until right before them. And that's not a good place to be because you don't really have any room to stop. And then you can find yourself going off of the end of the runway into the beach or the water. And speaking of the water, I'm not sure what this guy was trying to do, but when he gets the tires too far below the surface, it creates too much deceleration and the plane flips over. Now maybe he was going to try and just rinse the tires off like this guy did, but this is not something that I would recommend. And if you absolutely have to land on the water, then this is the best way to do it. And technically this isn't a crash, it's a forced water landing, also known as ditching. But if you have to do it, then just try and make sure you don't hit anyone that's swimming. Now obviously you typically don't get to decide when you're going to have an engine failure, and the other thing you can't control is the crosswinds. And watch what this pilot decides to do when he tries to land, because things seem to be going fine when all of a sudden either the wind shifts or there's some wind shear and it looks like he loses control. But that's when he applies full power and performs a go-around. But even with a very strong crosswind, it's pretty amazing what some pilots are able to do, because in order to land, the pilot has to crab into the wind. So he's kind of looking out the side of the plane instead of looking directly in front of him. And you can only get good at this with thousands of hours of experience, because you have to keep the aircraft under control using a combination of your hands on the control stick or the yoke and the throttles at the same time while using your feet to control the rudder. And you have to take out the crab at just the right time in order to get the plane safely on the ground. And it's also amazing how much stress the landing gear can take, especially on a huge plane like this Airbus 380. And sometimes even if you try your best, the windy conditions can still be too much to handle. And in those cases, even if you apply full power to go around like this guy, the plane still might touch down. And this is not really a situation that any pilot wants to be in. And this is why it's important to talk about crosswind landing considerations before you try to land. And at any point during the approach, if any of the pilots don't feel comfortable, they can say go around, and the pilot flying should execute the go around procedure. Because if you don't have the right control inputs and you hesitate to go around, then you could find yourself in a really bad situation and end up scraping a wingtip on the ground. And if you look closely at this, you can see that the wingtip hits pretty close to the center line of the runway, and this is at LaGuardia in New York. And because this is a 737 aircraft, that means if they had landed, the left main gear would have been off the side of the runway and they could have crashed, just like this student pilot. Because everything looks okay right now, but he forgets to use the rudder to keep the plane in the center of the runway, and as he drifts to the left, he increases power to try and go around, but overcorrects back to the right. Now he tries pulling back, but the plane is too slow to fly, and he tries steering with the yoke, but that's not going to do anything, and instead of stopping, he just crashes into the hangar. But thankfully he's okay, and if you watch carefully, the one thing that he does exceptionally well is that he looks really calm as he is making one wrong decision after the other, and that's probably because as a student pilot, you don't have a lot of past experiences for your brain to rely upon when you get into these very stressful situations. So instead, you're counting on your luck to save you, and in this case, he just didn't have a lot of luck. Something else that can result in a very dangerous landing situation is a pilot-induced oscillation, also known as a PIO. And pay attention very carefully to what this plane does as it gets closer to the runway, because this is something you want to avoid doing when you're trying to land. Basically, a PIO is kind of like porpoising the aircraft, and it's where a pilot tries to correct the pitch, but then ends up overcorrecting in the opposite direction, and each control input is bigger than the last, and it can be very dangerous because really the only way to fix the problem is to neutralize the controls and just let the plane settle down. Watch as he pitches nose up and then immediately pushes the nose down. And then he has to correct by pulling back so the nose gear doesn't slam into the ground, and that causes the main gear to slam down, so he's kind of just bouncing as he goes down the runway. But by this point, he's already applied full power to perform a go-around, and even if you don't have an engine and you're flying a glider, it's still possible to get into a PIO as you're trying to land. And again, it just can be a very dangerous situation, and you just need to neutralize the controls, allow the plane to basically fly itself out of the condition that you've put it in, and it'll eventually settle down. Now this pilot does something very similar. Watch as he pushes forward to pitch nose down very aggressively. They're not very far above the ground, and it's possible that the wind might have caused this and he's not actually pushing forward on the controls. But either way, it's a pretty scary situation because when you're that low to the ground, you want to have the plane flying a nice stabilized approach without any aggressive control inputs that might actually make things worse. And he gets pretty lucky because he was able to recover from the situation in order to land. And if you're ever flying on a plane that's about to land, you might as well get your phone out and go ahead and film it just in case something like this happens. Now, if you haven't heard of Ryanair, they're an ultra low-cost carrier that primarily operates out of Dublin and London. And they're the go-to airline basically for cheap flights all around Europe, and passengers always love complaining about them. And they've become somewhat infamous for their savage tweets like this one where Chantel asks, "What are your rules for tall people sitting on the planes where the legs don't fit in the normal seats?" And they replied, "Bend your knees." Now check out the landing because it seems as though the pilot forgot to flare. Now that's the kind of landing where you just want to keep the cockpit door closed until you're pretty sure all the passengers have gotten off the plane. Now the thing most people don't realize about Ryanair Airlines is that no matter how much people want to make fun of them or complain, they're obviously doing something right, because even though you might see a scary landing like this one where they almost scraped the wing on the ground, the airlines has never had a fatal accident in its 37-year flying history, so you're pretty safe flying with them. And technically it's easier to land in crosswinds with a bigger plane because it requires less crab when you're going 150 knots compared to only going 70 knots with a small single engine plane. But the challenge, especially when you have 4 engines like the 747, is that if you try keeping one wing low instead of a full crab into the wind, then there are crosswind limits for that, because if you dip one of the wings too low, then that outboard engine might actually strike the ground, and they narrowly avoided it here. This Cargolux plane wasn't as lucky. Now in this scenario, I've heard the pilots actually encountered some shifting winds during the approach, and sometimes that happens, but they did a really great job by going around instead of trying to salvage the landing. And if you like this video, then be sure to check out the craziest airplane engine failures, and I'll see you next time.